Welcome in. My name is Mark Reel Jr., the Father's Rights Attorney, and you're watching another episode of the Father's Rights Playbook. And on today's episode, I have Managing Attorney Ryan Dreyer here to talk about what happens to your business in a divorce. Ryan, how are we doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Glad to be here.
Yep, back again. So one of the issues that we deal with quite frequently and can get very, very complex is what happens to a business in a divorce. So it may be the couple running a business together. It may be one party entered the marriage with a business. One party started a business during the marriage. So I think a good place to start is, can you talk to our listeners and viewers a little bit about kind of the community property aspect in the beginning of what happens to your business?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just take it back to the beginning. Family Code 760, all property acquired during marriage is community property, right? Or I'm not sure.
So number one was the business formed before marriage or after marriage?
Correct. That's the first question we look at in any asset in divorce proceedings in California. When was it acquired? And that's the same for every asset or debt that we're looking at. But we have other issues that come up, right? So let's say that a spouse owned a business prior to marriage, but they continue operating the business during marriage. So what's going to happen there? Well, remember, each spouse's labor is owned by the community during marriage. So if you contribute your labor to a separate property business, the community is going to gain an interest in the business. And so some people, we're not going to go into it, but there's different methods of determining a community's interest in a separate property business or the separate property interest in a community business that's been contributed to post-separation. And you'll hear Pereira and Van Camp. We're not going to get into the calculations today. What we're going to say is, if the community has an interest in that business, it needs to be valued, and then we need to figure out how that business is going to be distributed. Now, sometimes business owners will say we have a business and we have a house or we have retirement accounts. They will try to trade their interest in the business for the interest in the house or some level of this, right?
Because there's some horse trading involved in property.
Absolutely. And it might sound sad, but realistically, we are putting down this entire marriage into a marital balance sheet. It's a balance sheet, right?
Yep.
It sounds sad, but that's what it is. We have to distribute the assets and debts equally, right? Regardless of fault, unless we have like some breach of fiduciary duty, we have to split those evenly. So for the listeners and viewers here, it doesn't matter if she was a stay-at-home mom and you were an entrepreneur operating this 7-figure business and you started it during marriage, it's 50-50. It is. It's a true partnership. And it's interesting.
Partner.
Yes, a silent partner. But if you look at Family Code 721, and it incorporates specifically the rights of a non-marital business partner, a partnership in that, right?
Well, that's something we run into too. Let's say you start a business during the marriage and you have 2 other partners. Let's say you're in real estate or whatever, and you have 3 people who start business together, flipping houses, rental properties, whatever it may be. And I think one of the crazier issues sometimes we deal with is that in the founding documents of the business, they complicate the marriage because the other 2 partners would have to agree to adding a 4th partner.
Correct. There is interesting aspects if we're talking about a community business or a business that the community has an interest that actually has other partners or other members in an LLC or other shareholders. And we could do a whole nother series on if you have multiple business partners and then they have wives or husbands, right? What happens when there's a divorce? Because that throws the business into disarray. That's where I would encourage people to have buy-sell agreements or have agreements in their operating agreement or provisions in their operating agreement or partnership. What happens if one of the members or the partners goes through a divorce? How is it valued? And a lot of times we can set that because this can be catastrophic for a business.
Yeah.
And the simple fact of we have other issues as a person that's not actually an operating member of the business now is going to get all their documents. So do we have non-disclosure agreements? Are there trade secrets that we have to protect? I mean, it goes on and on. It's complicated enough, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now of multiple owners where a divorce is affecting how that property is going to be. Because if the wife gets the business and the other two partners gets control of the business, and these partners don't want to be in operation of the business with them. So that's very complicated. But let's take it back just to a sole shareholder business or one member LLC.
Yeah.
When we have the divorce, we have to value that. So what's going to happen? First, we're going to need to get a business evaluation. So
Not cheap.
Not cheap. Now, you can choose your own evaluator, and the opposing side can choose their own evaluator. And then it's basically a battle of experts. A lot of times, the experts will meet and confer and come to an agreement as to the basic parameters of valuing it. The other way you can go is you can basically agree to an evidence code 730 evaluator, or petition the court on its own to appoint a 730 evaluator. So you're going to have a forensic accountant that's going to look at everything, not just the P&Ls, but they're going to go into the actual data, right? And to try to figure out what the value is. Another part when we're looking at business valuations is to determine what the cash flow in the business is. So that's going to be big on support, because we all know that one of the great things about owning a business is that you're going to run your personal expenses. We could be coy about it, but we all know people run their personal expenses through the business. Like, you'll always look at these giant Costco. Basically, every dollar spent at Costco is ran through that personal business, right? Yeah. So it's determining whether there's add backs and determining the value. Whether there's add backs and saying, well, they actually are making more income than is being stated.
This goes to another question that usually it gets a little hairy and a lot of guys struggle with is, you own a business, you run most, if not all, of your expenses through the business, and you don't take a regular salary or wage. That's where that forensic accountant comes in. Do you want to explain that process?
Yeah, because the forensic accountant is going to look at what they call add backs, right? And determining what are you really taking from this.
So even if you don't take a salary, they're going to take a look at what financial benefit you remove from the business for your own personal benefit.
Correct. And there's the other method is looking at the expenses that you have personally and saying, okay, well, do you have debt? No. Well, then we're going to say that you make X amount of money because you are able to pay your expenses. But the forensic accountant goes beyond that, right? I think most people can understand when we look at a ledger or a profit and loss statement, we can see where people would add personal expenses. So under auto, transportation, cellular phones, under travel and vacations, right?
Yeah.
In shopping receipts, clothing, things like that, that are going to be ran through there. And then, you're going to maybe you have your auto stipend, you have your other things such as that. Yeah. So, California is a non-reporting state. No one's required to say, hey, this person is defrauding the IRS or this guy's hiding income. But that attorney, if you have an opposing counsel, you better believe that they're going to look straight for your P&Ls. They're going to look at that. The presumption is that you're hiding money. I'll just say it as an attorney that's looked at tons of it. When you have your own business, I expect that you're running your personal expenses. I'm shocked if you're not running your personal expenses in it, right? And it's not that I'm mad at them. It's that my goal is to determine what their true income is and what is the true value of that business. Yeah. Now, there's another way that we can go, which is selling a business to a third party with a right to buy out, right? So, because you get some forensic accountants will argue that, well, evaluation is just the accountants guessing, right? They're educated guesses.
Yeah.
What's the truest way to determine the value, fair market value of an item? Put it on the open market and have it bid on, right? But most people want to keep their business. They don't want to sell their business. Now, I did have one time where they owned very successful retail stores. Well, they weren't super successful. One was successful and one wasn't. And that one had basically driven them into bankruptcy. And the bankruptcy trustee had established a receivership over it. And the receivership was running them into the ground and lowballing when they were looking for a third-party buyer. We ended up actually teaming up, husband and wife, and kicking the receivership out. Teaming up, each one of them became a member of the board of directors. We hired a third professional board of director and then an independent manager to run it. So these two actually continued to own the business together post-separation, and it turned out to be extremely successful. So there's not a single off-the-rack way, right? One spouse can buy out the other. They can maintain as business partners. I know it doesn't sound great, but there are ways that you can do it by including third-party professionals to run the business where you don't necessarily have to even sell the business, right?
I think that's the key in all of this. We talked about the first piece is the horse trading and getting the business whole onto the next stage of your life is probably the best option. But if you end up in a highly contentious divorce, anything can happen, and the expenses and what the business is going to go through can absolutely run it into the ground.
Absolutely. And I have actually seen people tank successful businesses rather than pay the other person any money. The other is remember, if you're diverting, if you create another business and you say, well, I created that post-separation, but you just divert all your clientele and goodwill into that, most attorneys aren't going to fall for that. Yeah. I mean, maybe, but for the most part, what I would try to do is get a true value and a plan to buy out that other spouse if you can, right? Again, I would also be careful. I've seen in court where the spouse running the business isn't absolutely necessary to run that business, and they lowball it, and so one spouse says, well, I think it's $1 million, and the other says 60, and that's where I would tell my client, sold for 60,000, right? So if you're gonna devalue, then come up and buy that business if they've lowballed it, right? So you got to be careful when you're doing an extreme lowballing of the business, right? Because there's just so much strategy that can really go on in this, right? Because to me, it's like, keep the business strong. Because if the business is strong, then the other, and one spouse gets it, the other one's probably going to get decent support off of that, right? Don't kill the golden goose.
Yeah, that's definitely a piece. That's a lot of really good information. I know we have a lot of entrepreneur dads or business owning, operating dads that this can provide a lot of value to. Ryan, thank you for your time today, and for all of our listeners and viewers, thank you for either listening or watching another episode of the Father's Rights Playbook. We'll see you guys again next week.
See you soon, guys. Thanks. Bye.